All right, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about value primarily. So we've been concentrating on shape, and shape is created by line first and foremost, but it can also be created by value. So we haven't necessarily talked about value very much yet. We've been focusing a lot on lines and contours, gestures, and getting the overall essence and shape of an object or a subject first. But I think another way to create shape and then to progress the drawing into something that, again, gives the illusion of value, form, 3D object in your 2D picture plane, your paper. The way to do that and to achieve that often deals with light and shadow or adding value to your drawing. So today we're going to talk a lot about value. Okay, so again, value is a way to create the essence of form. So value is not necessarily color. There are some correlations, but let's talk about what value is separate from color. So you can see the apple in red has obviously color, and then the duplicate of that is the picture in what I would call grayscale. So there is a difference between black and white and grayscale. Black and white is simply using a black and a white. Grayscale is using black and white and everything in between. So in this image, we do have the color version and also the grayscale version. So value and color, again, are related but not the same. Value refers specifically to the effects of light and shadow. Areas can be darker or lighter due to the light shining on them, and I would add to that reflecting off of them, being absorbed by them, being hidden by shadows, etc. They can also be lighter or darker due to color. So if you have a shirt lying on the ground that is a maroon shirt and it's maybe a white tile, the value of that shirt is going to be darker than the value of the tile. So there is some correlation to the value of color. Dark colors have a dark value, light colors have a light value. Value is the term for how light or dark an area looks in contrast with the rest of the image. It is easier to imagine value as how a thing would look in a black and white photograph. So I also teach photo, so this is a good way for my brain to also think about this. In a good photo, in the best photo, the highest quality photo, you want to have a white point and a black point. The white point in the photo, you can kind of digitally select that, or if you're a skilled photographer, you can set your exposure to that. The white point is the whitest white, a white pixel, a pixel with zero information. And then you can also set it to have a black point. So the black point is the area of the photograph that has the deepest, darkest blacks. So if you set a white point, the whitest white, and a black point, the blackest blacks, that then creates a really expansive, beautiful range of grays in between. So you can see in this image, this is Ansel Adams. You can see there are areas of highlight that are the whitest whites. We also can call that paper white. And then we have a lot of areas with very deep dark blacks. But what makes this a very, very rich and beautiful image is that it also has all of these in-between grays. So you get this beautiful contrast between the whitest white and the blackest black, but you also get all of these textural tones in between. So it creates a very lush image because we have so much information. Value equals information. Okay, so also when we're talking about color, we can have tints and shades. So if we have our original color, our primary color, that's going to be, in this example, red. If we add black to that, it becomes a shade of red. If we add white to that, it becomes a tint of red. And you can have that full spectrum from completely white to the pure pigment to completely black. And that is the range of saturation of the color. If we have something that is High saturation, that's going to be, again, the pure pigment. If we start adding pure gray, meaning the in-between of white and black, it becomes a low saturation color. So as we add that pure gray, we go from very vibrant high saturation to low saturation, and eventually you get to that pure gray color. So that is the way the color spectrum works. In drawing classes, we don't typically work with color too much unless it's pastels. So you don't need to know as much about that color range. If you do go on to take a color theory class, you'll learn all about that. Instead, we kind of work in this range over here because typically as drawers, we are working with pencil, we're working with pen and ink, and we're working with charcoal. So all of those are going to be value tones of black or gray. So again, paper white, that's going to be our purest white. Nothing is added to that. It's going to be the whitest white that you can achieve, which is going to be the original paper, all the way to the darkest mark that you could possibly make with your charcoal, ink, or pencil. Now, the interesting part about this is that there is no high or low saturation. So when we are dealing with just black and white imagery, it is low saturation to begin with. There is no pure pigment, there is no pure color, because we have removed all of the color from that. So if you look at this spectrum here, all of these saturation intensities are the same color, because it's not as if we are adding or removing color to that. We are already working with a value scale, a black and white, a gray scale. Okay. Value scale. So this is a very important thing. This is similar to the exercise I had you do in the beginning where you were just playing with your pencils and going from lightest light to darkest dark. So you made a very primitive version of a value scale when doing that. So a value scale is a visual breakdown of the different values in an image. Value creates visual dimension. The more distinct values an image has, the more realistic it will look. Generally, a realistic looking drawing will use at least 7 to 9 different values. So again, I think it's a nice rule of thumb to always include every single one of those values from your quote unquote white point to your black point, because that will create an overall rich image. And sometimes that could be different from what we see in real life. So for example, if I was doing a drawing of a snowball in the middle of winter, maybe I wouldn't see too much of the blackest black. But if I were to recreate that in drawing, I probably would overemphasize some of those shadows so that I could reach a total black point that I then could reference to the white point and have that nice contrast to create a beautiful, lush image. If an image is washed out or dull looking, it is less interesting for us as viewers. So typically it's always a good thing to seek all of that value range from lightest lights to darkest darks and every one of those steps in between. That will give you the best quality, the richest drawing. Okay, so this image is mostly just to talk about how we describe these. So lights are, the 1/3 of the spectrum with the lightest values. The darks are obviously the reverse of that. In between, we call those halftones. So a halftone is kind of your middle gray. In a value scale, they are all mathematically equal. So you're going at a regular step each time you go across one of those squares. It increases the value at a mathematical equivalent value. Okay, so the middle gray is in the middle of the value scale. It is an equal mix of the darkest and the lightest value. Here, the middle gray is being contrasted with the rest of the values in the value scale as a comparison. So essentially, we're taking the mid-tone, which is the value in between right here, and just placing that in all of the scales along. So you can also think about, this is part of Joseph Albers and the idea of our visual perception of contrast. So when we do look at this middle gray on a white, it appears darker versus this middle gray on a dark that looks lighter, and that is because our eyes kind of seek contrast. So when I have two different tones right next to each other, they both appear a little bit more dramatic. Okay, so this image here is technically black and white, meaning it has black or white. It's sort of a binary. If we were coding this on a website, it could be a binary. Black is 1 and white is 0. It either is black or white. That is a black and white image. It is either one or the other. So this one also is to articulate this idea of contrast. So this is a high contrast image, meaning there is no shade of gray in between. So it is either black or white and high contrast. Okay. Again, articulating this idea of high contrast, again, we have the deepest darks and the whitest whites and some in between. This one, we do not have a darkest dark, and we don't have a lightest light. So it's high contrast versus low contrast. So this one is made of halftones. Okay, so when I talk about contrast, that simply means difference. So it's the same type of language that we can also use to, when you're writing an English essay and they say, contrast the argument points between side A and side B. It's just the difference between those. So how different are they? That's how we also talk about value. So if I say something has high contrast, it means there's a lot of difference between the white and the black. If I say it has low contrast, it means there's not too much difference. All the colors and values are very similar. Having high contrast as well as a wide range of values makes for a dynamic and realistic looking image. So again, two things are happening when you have a high value image or an image with a large value range. One, it helps you get a sense of that form a little bit more. So this feels like it's a cylinder. This feels like it sits in space. There's a sense of depth, there's a sense of weight and mass and volume there. The other thing that contrast does is help provide the sense of shape. So instead of relying on purely the contour or the lines and the edges of things, these shapes are being created by the tonal difference in the values. So when you work with value, a really beautiful thing can happen in your drawings in that you don't have to rely on line so much. You can make it a lot softer and more poetic to just define the edges by a light versus a dark area. So it's this wonderful realization that your eraser can create just as beautiful shapes as the pencil. All right, so in that, we'll then talk about form. Again, these go hand in hand, so they're different terms, but when we are drawing and when we are using them, we kind of use one to create the other. So we use value to create form. Form refers to the physical shape of a thing or object. It also is related to light and shadow. You can't have form without light and shadow. Form is the 3D dimensionality of something, and all 3D objects catch light, reflect it, and cast a shadow. So again, this is this idea that I've talked about a couple of times, that we are translating the 3D world into a 2D picture plane. So within that, we have to really mimic and create the illusion that what this object is doing in space, we can then recreate on the paper. So we have to be really careful observers and say, all right, this object in space is the brightest on this side, it's the darkest on this side, but even in between that, we can say this is the white point right here, this is the brightest part of the image, but this is a mid-tone, and it actually might be a little bit darker than it is as the light is reflecting off of this white table here. So this is reflecting, creating a little bit lighter area here, and again, this is all the darkest image. The light is not hitting this area, but again, the white surface is reflecting a little bit, so instead of creating a harsh line to delineate that space, it actually does get a little bit lighter there, and that's a really nice kind of subtle way to create the definition of the edge of the object. And then here's the darkest shadow, where the object meets the table, where it's casting that really dramatic shadow. So even within these planes of different values, there are different relationships of light and shadow as it plays along these complex forms. Light is pretty complex, and 3D objects in space also are pretty complex. So our goal to be a proficient, masterful drawer is to really carefully observe how that is happening and how I can then translate that through my hand to the drawing medium. As light shines on objects, it generates lights and shadows. So this is one of the very helpful roadmaps you have to really understanding the way that light and shadow work on an object. So this is the map, the roadmap, the diagram. This is very common. You will see this in every single drawing textbook, and this is the components that every object has. So we have always a light source. There's light coming from somewhere, always. Where that hits directly is going to be the highlight area. Surrounding that is typically the mid-tone. You have a core shadow, so that's the part of the object that has the most dark and natural shadow, but then it gets a little bit brighter again as the surface is reflected upon that. So often where you would assume the darkest shadow would be is actually a lighter line creating the definition of that shape because there is reflected light. And when I see drawings that have reflected light in them, that to me is an indicator that this is a really poetic and beautiful, thoughtful drawing because it was such attention to detail that it actually goes against your impulse to draw what you think you know, right? The dark is dark, but that's not what real life is doing. There is a little bit of reflected shadow in there, or I'm sorry, reflected light. And then the cast shadow, again, is where your object is going to block the light source. So that is the cast shadow. Again, typically that is darkest where the object meets the surface, whatever it's sitting on, and then gets softer around the edges. Sometimes you can have a hard shadow and sometimes you can have a soft shadow. So do also be careful of how you're delineating the edges of those shadows because they can be very different depending on the type of light source you have. Adding hatched lines to a circle to create a sphere using light and shadow. So we're kind of using those things that we learned before, which is the cross contour, to also then translate this into light and shadow. Value on a form is also affected by distance. The further something is from a light source, the darker the values will be. Things that are further from a light source will also have less contrast. So when we're looking at this sphere that is closest to the light source, we do have brightest bright, and I wouldn't say that that is a blackest black, but there is a lot of contrast between that white and that darkest point. Versus the one that is farthest away, this is primarily a mid-tone. There is one small highlight and also a lot of cast shadow. And this will always be different the farther things are from a light source. It also depends on the value of whatever it's, if it's sitting on a surface or if it's hovering above a surface. It will depend on also if you have multiple light sources. Often we live in the real world and we might have sun shining through the window, we might have an overhead light, and we might have light coming from another room. So often we also have different light sources coming at us, which then again always creates a really unique sense of light and shadow. So all of these spheres still belong to that roadmap that we talked about with the core shadow, the cast shadow, reflected light, etc. But they all are arranged in different ways. So every time you look at an object, that lighting scenario will be different. It will even be different from now to 2 hours from now because the sun and the light will change, right? So it's always very unique, but you can always find those core components. Planes. Objects have surfaces, and those surfaces can be flat, textured, and/or curved. The qualities of the surfaces of an object determine how the light and shadow will look. Planes happen when forms change in direction, creating areas of light and shadow. They help create dimension. Keeping values together in a plane is how an artist creates dimension on a flat surface. So all of that to say, every object we can break down into planes. So even a shape that feels very organic, right? Something that's very soft and curvilinear, we have separate planes. So as I'm, looking, let's see. As I'm looking at my face right now, I have the planes of the side of my face. I have a plane of my forehead. I have planes where my nose comes out, the top of my nose. I have planes coming this way. So my face, even though it's made of organic shapes, still consists of different planes. And those planes are creating different areas where the light is interacting with them. So I have a large light source coming from this direction, so it's hitting the planes in highlights on those areas that are either protruding or kind of coming out to meet. And then I have planes of my face where it's more in shadow, right? And I can break my face down into singular planes and think about how the light is affecting each one of those planes, even though my face is made up of very soft, round shapes. It's not angular, it's not dimensional, it's not a, hard geometric form. Despite that, I can still think about how these planes interact with space and how those planes are reacting to the light source. So primarily one light source coming from this side, but also one coming from there, one coming from there. So again, this is a unique scenario that will change in an hour, but I can still break that down into planes that react to light and shadow. And you can do that with every single shape. So some shapes are obviously a little bit easier and more intuitive, but even something more complex like this can be broken down or thought of as shapes like this. A wide range of values helps to create a realistic 3D form. The shapes on the left feel flat because they only have two values. So again, this is more of a black and white, a binary. It's either white or it's dark. And we get the essence, it feels like an illustration. I understand what they're getting at, but it doesn't necessarily feel real. It doesn't feel like a realistic illusion of a 3D space versus this side over here, the shapes on the right have a range of tonal values. So that range of tonal values helps to create a sense of volume and form. The value of a plane is dependent on the light source. So again, if we're thinking about planes in space, this one's going to be a mid-tone, this one's a little bit darker, this one's the darkest, and this cast shadow is also a different value. But even within that, you can get gradients or a range of those tones. So I will challenge you to just think about objects in space and really start to look at, oh, I'm looking at a box right now, and within this box I can see that one corner is very bright, and then it goes a little bit darker towards the other corner. The plane that's facing away from me is an even mid-tone. So just start kind of picking out items in space and start thinking about how the light and shadow is interacting with them. Is it casting a shadow? Is it a hard shadow or a soft shadow? Are there gradients? Which area is the darkest? Which area is the lightest? Just start thinking about that. Planes must have different values according to the light source in order to look realistic. So the idea is that no two planes can be the same value if they are all facing different angles in relation to one singular light source. So it's the idea that every plane has to be a different value. And if you can accurately create the value of each plane, it gives you the illusion of form and mass. Okay, so again, this is a really beautiful illustration of what I was talking about. So even an organic shape like a face, that has a lot of, soft, organic, protruding shapes can be broken down into individual planes, and those individual planes all have a different reaction to light and shadow. Even on curved objects, finding planes can be helpful to determine areas of light and shadow. This process is called planar analysis. Think of it as blocking in, which we learned, right? So you learned how to do that blocking, but for value rather than proportion. So that's why we're learning this second also, is because you need to understand the proportion, you need to understand those lines and how to create an accurate shape, but now we're adding one more ingredient to that recipe, which is then, once you've found that, create the value with that. But I would also say that it is helpful for my brain to also create proportions with light and shadow. So the last exercise I had you do, which was just the highlights of those shapes, also helps to create better proportions, because if I'm doing this drawing by just looking at the highlights, I then can break down the shape into, what is this, like a sideways blocky S or a wave here, and I can think about these as half moons. So when I do think about breaking down a complex image into the highlight areas and the deep shadow areas, it can also help kind of hone down in on the idea of the proportion of the shapes and help you get an accurate representation of the scale and proportion of things. Okay, and that is it. That was a little lengthy, but hopefully that gave you a lot of information and hopefully gets you excited to move forward, and some strategies. We will be using strategies from that PowerPoint as some of our exercises, which will culminate in our project, which will be a whole scene of light and value. So I'll give you some more exercises, and then we'll ramp it up in the difficulty again. I'm just giving you more and more ingredients to make that magical recipe.